The year was 1876, and the wind, as always, was the first and last thing to have its say. It scoured the Kansas plains, carrying red dust that settled like a second skin on everything and everyone. It rattled the windows of the small clapboard church and worried the edges of the freshly turned earth in the cemetery. Evelyn Hart stood by the grave, the black fabric of her dress a stark cut against the muted landscape. The wind whipped a stray strand of her auburn hair across her face, but she did not raise a hand to brush it away. She was 24 years old and a widow. The town itself was little more than a smudge of coal dust and desperation clinging to the iron spine of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a place people passed through, not a place they stayed. Thomas had stayed, and now he would stay forever, under a thin blanket of unforgiving soil. He had been a merchant of small ambitions and even smaller successes, a man whose dreams had a habit of crumbling into dust, much like the very ground that now held him. The preacher's words had been hollow, a string of practiced platitudes about fever and God's inscrutable will. Evelyn had listened with a stillness that the other mourners mistook for grief-stricken piety. It was not piety. It was the quiet, simmering rage of a woman who knew the truth was a far uglier thing. Back in the 2 rooms above the general store that she and Thomas had called home, the air was stale with the lingering scent of sickness and failure. The furniture was sparse, the floorboards scrubbed bare. Evelyn had always been frugal, a habit born of necessity that had hardened into a principle. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood of the small box on the table, the only inheritance of any real substance. It was not full of money or deeds to prosperous businesses. It held the detritus of their life together, a small, leather-bound journal filled with Thomas's looping, optimistic script, his plain gold wedding band, which had become too loose for his finger in the end, and a folded, hand-drawn map. The lawyer had already come and gone, a fussy little man who smelled of mothballs and condescension. He had read the will in a monotone, his eyes darting around the room as if assessing the value of each meager possession. The contents of that will were the reason her mind was not on grief, but on the precipical edge of disbelief. It was a single sheet of paper, a last testament that made no sense. It left her no money, no property in this town, nothing but a bizarre directive. Go west, Thomas had written. Claim the Bluefinch gold mine in Montana. Trust no one. A gold mine. The words were so preposterous she had nearly laughed in the lawyer's face. Thomas, who could not balance a ledger for his own failing dry goods business, had apparently owned a gold mine in Montana, a place as distant and mythical to her as the moon. And the final, stark instruction, trust no one, was a chilling counterpoint to the wild fantasy of the bequest. It felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. She opened the wooden box. The journal was on top. She traced the letters of his name embossed on the cover. She had loved him, or at least she had loved the gentle, hopeful man he had been when they first married. But the last year had eroded that man, worn him down with a fear that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with men. It was not a fever that had taken Thomas' heart. It had been a different kind of sickness, one that came in the form of quiet, imposing visitors who never stayed long but left behind a residue of terror that clung to Thomas like the ever-present dust. They were debt collectors, and their methods had been brutally effective. They had squeezed the life from him, not with a weapon, but with the slow, relentless pressure of what he owed. Evelyn's secret was a bitter stone in her gut. Her husband had not died of an illness. He had died of shame and fear, cornered by his own poor decisions. She felt a pang of guilt for her own part in it, for pushing him to take risks, for wanting more than this dusty, dead-end town could ever offer. The world outside her window was a study in grit and motion. The main street was a churn of mud and dust, kicked up by the hooves of freight horses and the boots of railroad men. The saloon across the way exhaled a constant cloud of cheap tobacco smoke and the tinny clang of a poorly played piano. The wind was a constant presence, a physical force that seemed to want to strip the very buildings from their foundations. This was the West she knew, a place of hard labor, small rewards, and a constant, grinding struggle. Montana and its supposed gold mines felt like a fiction, a fairy tale told to a dying man. She picked up the box, intending to put it away, when her fingers brushed against a loose piece of fabric on the bottom. The lining, a cheap velvet, was peeling at the corner. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, pricked at her. She worked her fingernail under the edge and pulled. The fabric came away with a soft ripping sound, revealing a smaller, folded piece of paper tucked into a hollowed-out space in the wood. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It was Thomas's handwriting again, but this time it was hasty, almost frantic. A postscript to his final command. It was only 5 words. The debt collectors will follow. The air left her lungs in a rush. The vague paranoia of trust no one now had a face, a name, a direction. It was not just a warning. It was a certainty. They were not finished with Thomas Hart, even now that he was dead. They knew about the mine. The will was not a fantasy. It was a map to a treasure they believed was theirs. Suddenly, the impossible directive felt like the only possible path. To stay here was to wait for them. To be a fly caught in a web she could not see. To go west was to run, yes, but it was also to run towards something. Toward a claim, a chance, a life that was her own. The decision settled over her, not with a sense of adventure, but with the cold, hard weight of necessity. She would go. She would go alone. The seed of the conflict had been planted long before Thomas's death, in the ledgers of a man who owned this town and everyone in it, Judge Mallory. He was more than a judge. He was a financier, a landlord, a tyrant in a tailored suit who held the reins of every significant enterprise. He collected debts the way other men collected stamps, and his interest was always in the collateral. Evelyn didn't know the full extent of it, but she knew Thomas had borrowed from Mallory, and she knew the judge was not a man who forgave a debt. The Bluefinch mine, whether it held a fortune or was just another of Thomas's failed dreams, was now Mallory's target, and she, Evelyn Hart, was in his way. She could almost feel his eyes on her, could sense the gears of his cold, calculating mind turning. He would not let such a prize slip through his fingers. He would send his men. Packing was a simple affair. She had little of value. A few sturdy dresses, her sewing kit, a small amount of cash saved from her egg money, and the wooden box. She paused, looking at her reflection in the wavy glass of the mirror. The face that looked back was pale and drawn, but the eyes were clear. The grief was there. A deep, aching void where her husband used to be. But beneath it, something new was taking root, a core of resolve, as hard and unyielding as iron. Thomas had left her with a puzzle and a threat. He had left her to face his demons, but he had also, in his own desperate, fumbling way, given her a way out. The train station was a cacophony of steam, shouting men, and the groaning of metal. The wind was particularly cruel here, funneling between the building and lifting the grit from the platform to sting her eyes. She bought a one-way ticket to Cheyenne. Wyoming, it was as far as her money would take her for now. From there, she would have to find a way north, following the crude map Thomas had drawn. As she stood on the platform, clutching the handle of her worn trunk, she saw them. 2 men standing near the baggage car. They were not railroad men. They wore city clothes, slightly too fine for this town, and they stood with an air of patient stillness that was more menacing than any overt threat. They did not look at her, but she felt their awareness of her as a physical pressure. One of them lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating a hard, emotionless face. They were Mallory's men, the debt collectors. They had tickets for the same train. The whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that echoed the hollowness inside her. The great engine hissed, a beast of iron and steam preparing to pull her away from the only life she had ever known and into a vast, dangerous unknown. For a moment, a wave of pure terror washed over her. She was alone, a woman with no protection, no allies, hunted by men who served a powerful, ruthless master. Then she looked past the station, to the endless, dusty plains stretching to the horizon. Out there was Montana. Out there was the Bluefinch mine. Out there was a chance. The fear receded, replaced by the cold, clear anger that had been her companion since Thomas's death. Anger at him, for his weakness. Anger at Mallory, for his greed. Anger at a world that allowed men like him to crush men like her husband. She tightened her grip on her trunk, her knuckles white. She would not be crushed. She boarded the train, found a seat by a grimy window, and did not look back. As the locomotive lurched forward, pulling her away from the town of ash and sorrow, she made a silent vow, her words a whisper against the rattling glass. If there is justice in this land, I will find it myself. Cheyenne was a city carved from the high plains, a testament to sheer, stubborn will. The wind here had a different voice than it did in Kansas. It was a high, keening howl that seemed to carry the cold from the distant mountains. A sound that promised long winters and short tempers. The air was thin and sharp, and Evelyn felt a lightness in her head as she stepped down from the train. Buildings of raw timber and brick stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades staring out at the endless expanse of sagebrush and sky. A wooden church steeple pointed a finger at heaven, while not 2 blocks away, the swinging doors of a dozen saloons offered a more immediate kind of salvation. The smell of coal smoke and pine mixed with the rich, earthy scent from the livery stables. This was a place of purpose, a crossroads of ambition and grit. Evelyn kept her head down, her hand tight on the handle of her trunk. She was acutely aware of the 2 men who had disembarked from a separate car. They did not follow her directly, but lingered near the station, their presence a cold weight on the back of her neck. She needed a room, a place where she could think, a place where she could bolt the door. She found a boarding house, but the proprietor's eyes were too curious, his questions too pointed. She moved on, her search leading her down a side street where a modest sign hung over a clean-looking storefront, Pike's Coffee and Provisions. The bell above the door chimed a welcome. The inside was warm and smelled of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and baking bread. It was a haven of domesticity in the heart of the wild. A woman stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with knowing gray eyes and a mouth that looked as if it were more accustomed to delivering sharp truths than sweet smiles. "Looking for something, or just escaping the wind?" the woman asked, her voice as crisp as the mountain air. "A room, if you have one to let," Evelyn said, her own voice sounding small and tired to her ears. The woman's gaze swept over Evelyn, taking in the black dress, the worn trunk, the exhaustion in her posture, and the defiant set of her jaw. It was a look that missed nothing. "I have a room upstairs, quiet, clean. The door has a new lock, $10 a week. Breakfast included." It was more than Evelyn could comfortably afford, but the mention of a new lock was worth the price. "I'll take it." "Name's Nora Pike," the woman said, not offering a hand but giving a firm nod. "You can pay me at the end of the week." Lets a person get their bearings. As Evelyn paid for a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly, Nora watched her. "You running from something? Or to something?" Evelyn stiffened. "I am on my way to Montana. On business." Nora gave a short, humorless laugh. "Honey, in Cheyenne, everyone is on their way somewhere else. And it's always called business. Just some advice. Out here, you don't want to look like you're running. You want to look like you know exactly where you're going, even if you're lost as a calf in a blizzard. And another thing," she added, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping. "Never turn down a kindness, but always understand its price. Best to let people feel they owe you a favor. It's better currency than coin." Over the next few days, Evelyn learned that Nora Pike's wisdom was as strong and bracing as her coffee. The widow had buried 2 husbands and outlasted a dozen business rivals. She knew the workings of Cheyenne, from the halls of the territorial legislature to the back alleys where deals were struck with a handshake and a threat. She saw the shadows of Mallory's men lingering across the street and said nothing. But that evening, she placed a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth on the table in Evelyn's room. "It was my first husband's," Nora said, unwrapping a pearl-handled derringer. "Small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. He said a surprise is a woman's best weapon. Tomorrow, we'll go out back of the stables. You need to learn how it feels to make a loud noise." The next morning, Evelyn met two more people who would become unexpected anchors in her new life. The first was a boy named Eli, a whip-thin orphan of about 10 with a shock of unruly brown hair and a perpetually smudged face. He sold newspapers on the corner, shouting headlines with a theatrical flair that drew customers in. "Extra, extra, read all about it. Railroad baron's wife in scandalous affair," he yelled as Evelyn passed. "Paper, ma'am, only a nickel to know what the rich folks are doing wrong." Evelyn bought a paper, and the boy's sharp eyes took her in. "You're new, staying at Nora's place. Two fellas in city hats been asking about the new arrivals." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" Eli grinned, showing a gap where a tooth should have been. "I told them a whole family of Swedish farmers came in on the morning train. Big fellas. Said they were heading for the saloon. Cost me a whole story." "Ma'am, a good story is worth another nickel." Evelyn gave him the nickel. An alliance was formed. Eli became her lookout, a small, fast-moving source of information who could go places she could not. The second person was Deputy Carlos Ortega. He came into the coffee shop for his morning cup, a tall, lean man with a kind, weathered face and a thick, dark mustache. He moved with a quiet grace, his lawman's badge and the Colt revolver on his hip looking like natural parts of him. He greeted Nora with a familiar, easy humor, his English carrying the soft, musical lilt of his Mexican heritage. Nora introduced him to Evelyn. The deputy tipped his hat, his eyes warm but intelligent. "Ma'am, welcome to Cheyenne. I hope the city is treating you well." "It is, thank you, Deputy," Evelyn replied cautiously. Later, when the shop was empty, Ortega took a seat at her table. "Nora tells me you're traveling alone," he said gently. "It is not my business to pry, but I would be a poor lawman if I did not notice things. For instance, I notice two men who do not belong here, who spend their days watching this shop, and I know the sort of man who employs such men. I received a telegraph from a colleague in Kansas. A man named Judge Mallory has a long reach." He paused, letting the name settle in the air between them. "He believes the law is a tool he can buy and sell. Here in my town, it is not, but a man like that. He finds other tools. Be careful. Mrs. Hart." The warning solidified Evelyn's resolve. Her survival was not a matter of chance. It was a matter of preparation. Nora was a patient but demanding teacher. The derringer was small, but its kick was vicious, and the noise it made was a deafening crack that made Evelyn's ears ring. At first, she flinched every time she pulled the trigger, her shots going wide of the tin cans they had set up. "You're not trying to scare it," Nora instructed, her voice firm. "You're trying to stop it. Aim for the center. Don't think, just point and squeeze. The thinking comes before you draw." Slowly, Evelyn's aim improved. The trembling in her hands lessened, replaced by a steady resolve. She learned to load and clean the small pistol, its cold, metallic weight a constant reminder of the world she now inhabited. She bought a sturdy pair of boots and stitched a small holster inside one of them. Next came the horses. She had ridden before, but only gentle mares on flat country roads. Nora took her to the livery, where a gruff stablemaster taught her the difference between riding and surviving on horseback. She learned to saddle her own mount, to read the signs of a tired or lame animal, and to sit a horse for hours on end until every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She studied Thomas's map, comparing it to the official territorial maps at the land office, planning a route that would take her through the Bighorn Basin and into Montana. Every day was a lesson in self-reliance, a slow shedding of the woman she had been. The attack came on a moonless night a week after her arrival. Evelyn was in her room, mending a tear in her dress by the light of a single oil lamp. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. It was a sound different from the usual groans of the old building. She froze, her needle poised in midair. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Then, a faint scratching sound at her door. Near the lock. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She slipped off her shoes, her hand going instinctively to her boot where the derringer was nestled. She crept across the room to the window that overlooked the back alley. Below, the night was dark and still. She had nowhere to go. The scratching stopped. A moment later, a thin piece of metal slid into the keyhole. It was a professional job. The lock clicked open with an oily finality. The door began to swing inward, just as the first shadow fell across the floor. A sound ripped through the night. A sound so loud and powerful it seemed to shake the entire town. It was the shriek of a steam whistle from the train depot. A long, sustained blast that shattered the silence. It was followed by another and another. Shouts erupted in the street outside. Lights flickered on in windows. The man in her doorway cursed, startled. Another man whispered urgently from the hall. "What is that? What's happening?" They hesitated. Caught between their task and the chaos outside, the whistle screamed again. It was a signal of some great emergency, a fire or a derailment. Reluctantly, the men withdrew, pulling the door shut behind them. Evelyn heard their hurried footsteps retreating down the stairs. She waited, her back pressed against the wall, the small pistol cold and heavy in her hand, until she heard the front door of the shop below open and close. She was safe, for now. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had saved her. She found Nora in the kitchen, calmly making a pot of coffee as if nothing had happened. "I have a friend who works the night shift at the depot," Nora said simply, not looking at Evelyn. "He owes me a favor, a big one." She poured 2 cups. "They'll be back. You need to leave soon." Evelyn sat down, her body trembling with adrenaline. "Thank you." "Nora." "Don't thank me," Nora said, her voice softening for the first time. "Just make it to where you're going, and when you get there, you be the one who can pull the whistle for somebody else." Later that night, unable to sleep, Evelyn sat with the newspaper Eli had sold her. She wasn't reading it, merely staring at the columns of dense type, her mind replaying the events of the evening. Her eyes fell on a small article datelined from Helena, Montana. It spoke of the territory's booming mining industry and its most prominent figure, a man the paper called the Copper King of Helena. The article described him as a reclusive and formidable tycoon who had built an empire from nothing. It told a brief story of how he had personally funded a rescue operation to save a group of trapped miners at a competitor's claim, spending a fortune to bring them out alive. The reporter ended the piece with a line of local gossip. "It is said of Griffin Hale that when he chooses to save someone, he saves them completely." The image of a powerful, decisive man, a rescuer, floated in Evelyn's mind for a moment. It was a tempting thought. The idea of a protector in this harsh land. Then, reality set in, cold and sharp. She was not a trapped miner. She was a widow with a contested claim, and tycoons did not rescue people like her out of the goodness of their hearts. They acted out of self-interest, for profit and power. They were just a more successful version of Judge Mallory. She folded the newspaper, a wry, cynical smile touching her lips. "Tycoons," she whispered to the quiet room, "only rescue themselves." The journey north was a rhythmic clatter of steel on steel, a hypnotic lullaby that failed to soothe the sharp edges of Evelyn's nerves. She had left Cheyenne under the cover of a pre-dawn mist, her ticket purchased for the northbound train that locals called the Yellowstone Express. Nora had pressed a small purse of coins and a parcel of dried beef and hard biscuits into her hands at the station. "This isn't a kindness," Nora had said, her voice gruff. "It's an investment. Now go make it a profitable one." Eli had been there too, slipping her a small, folded note that simply read, "They are on your train. 2 cars back. She was not escaping. She was merely leading the chase. For 2 days, the train snaked through a landscape of breathtaking emptiness. The high plains rolled away on all sides, a vast sage-dotted ocean under a sky so big it seemed to press down on the land. At night, the stars were a brilliant, cold scatter of diamonds on black velvet, and the only light on earth was the warm, swaying glow from the train's own windows. Evelyn sat with her back straight, the small wooden box containing her future resting on her lap, disguised within a larger carpet bag. She ate little, slept in short, wary bursts, and spoke to no one. Every time the conductor passed, every time a passenger walked down the aisle, her hand drifted to the top of her boot, where the cool handle of the derringer was a small, hard promise. On the evening of the 3rd day, the world outside the window began to change. The clear, sharp light of dusk softened, then grew hazy, as if a veil of gauze had been drawn across the sky. The color bled away, leaving a strange, yellowish twilight. A fine dust, almost a powder, began to hiss against the glass. Passengers murmured, peering out at the unnatural gloom. The rhythmic rocking of the car grew more violent, the train groaning as it pushed against a rising, unseen force. The sandstorm hit them not like weather, but like a physical assault. The wind rose to a solid wall of sound, a deafening roar that swallowed all other noises. The world outside vanished into a churning, opaque chaos of brown and red. Sand found its way through every crack in the carriage, dusting the velvet seats, coating every surface with a fine, gritty film. It was in Evelyn's mouth, in her eyes. The oil lamps hanging from the ceiling swayed wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows that made the familiar space of the train car seem alien and threatening. The train slowed to a crawl, its powerful engine laboring against the storm's immense pressure. Hours passed in the roaring darkness. The air in the car grew thick and stale. A baby cried fretfully. A man swore under his breath. Fear, unspoken but palpable, settled over the passengers. They were a tiny, fragile capsule of light and warmth adrift in a maelstrom. Then, with a jarring lurch and a screech of brakes that was barely audible over the wind, the train shuddered to a halt. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then the conductor, a man with a weathered face and worried eyes, fought his way down the aisle, bracing himself against the lurching of the stationary car. "Folks, I'm sorry," he shouted over the din. "The line ahead is completely buried. Drifts are already covering the tracks behind us. We're diverting. We've managed to make it to a siding for the Kestrel depot. It's an old telegraph and water stop. We'll have to wait out the storm there." A wave of groans and anxious questions followed him. Kestrel. The name struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. She fumbled in her bag, past the weight of the derringer, her fingers finding the folded, brittle paper of Thomas's map. She spread it on her lap, her heart pounding. There, in the spider web of lines he had drawn, was a small dot along the main rail line, and beside it, in his familiar script, a note Kestrel change for short line. It had to be a sign, a piece of a puzzle she was only just beginning to understand. This storm, this diversion. It was not a setback. It was an opportunity, a path Thomas had, for some reason, wanted her to see. She had no idea what the short line was, or where it went, but in this moment, it felt like a lifeline, a way to break the straight, predictable path she was on, a path her hunters were also on. The conductor forced the door open against the wind, and a blast of sand and frigid air swept through the car. "We'll be here for the foreseeable future. Folks, there's a waiting room in the depot if you want to stretch your legs, but I wouldn't wander far." Evelyn made her decision in an instant. This was her chance to disappear. She stood, gathering her things. She had 2 bags. The larger carpet bag held the precious wooden box and the derringer. The other, a smaller valise, contained her clothes and other necessities. An idea, a desperate gamble inspired by Nora's cynical wisdom, began to form in her mind. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, a spare sheet she used for calculations. With a pencil, she quickly sketched a crude copy of a section of Thomas's map, but she altered it, marking a trail that led south, toward Colorado, as other passengers began to stir, grumbling and stretching. Evelyn moved down the aisle. She feigned a stumble, lurching against a seat. "Oh, goodness," she murmured, her voice slurred with what sounded like exhaustion and drink. "This storm makes my head spin." She let the smaller valise, the one with her clothes, slip from her grasp. At the same moment, she let the forged map flutter to the floor, half hidden beneath the seat. She saw a flicker of interest in the eyes of a man 2 rows back, a man with a city hat. She scooped up the valise, leaving the false map where it lay, and pushed her way toward the door. On the platform, she feigned another moment of disorientation, swaying on her feet and allowing the larger, more important carpet bag to slip from her shoulder and fall to the planks with a heavy thud. It was a calculated risk. She needed them to see both bags, to associate her with both. The Kestrel station was less a building and more a scar on the landscape. It was a long, low structure of weathered wood, crouched against the fury of the wind. A few oil lanterns hung from the eaves, their light a feeble, flickering yellow that was swallowed by the swirling sand just a few feet away. The platform was empty save for a few other hardy souls who had braved the elements. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where all illusions of safety and civilization were scoured away by the raw power of the land. Evelyn squinted through the gale. She saw a board nailed to the depot wall, the timetable for connecting lines. This was it. This would tell her about the short line Thomas had mentioned. As she drew closer, her hopes sank. The board was a mess of faded paint and peeling wood. But there, under Kestrel, one line was still faintly legible. Kestrel short line to Silver Creek. Departure 6:15 a.m. Silver Creek. It was not on her map, but it was a destination, a new direction. Then she saw them. Mallory's 2 men had followed her off the train. They were not trying to hide now. They moved with a predatory purpose, separating slightly to cut off her retreat. One of them gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the far end of the platform, where a single, dark shape was barely visible through the storm. A lone, abandoned freight car, its doors slightly ajar, sitting on a dead-end siding. It was a box, a trap. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her, but Nora's voice cut through it. "You want to look like you know exactly where you're going, even if you're lost as a calf in a blizzard." She remembered the trick Nora had taught her, the desperate gambit of a cornered woman. She took a shaky breath and began to act. She listed to one side, as if a gust of wind had caught her off balance. She clutched her head. So dizzy, she muttered loudly to no one, her voice carrying on the wind. She started walking, not toward the depot waiting room, but unsteadily toward the dark end of the platform, toward the freight car. She was making herself the easiest possible prey. She fumbled with her carpet bag, the one with the box, pretending it was too heavy for her. The men fell into step behind her, their boots making no sound in the roaring wind. They were herding her now. She could feel their confidence, their satisfaction at her foolishness. She let her smaller valise, the decoy with her clothes, fall from her hand again. She turned, swaying, and looked back at it, then at them. "Could one of you gentlemen—" she began, her voice trailing off as if she were about to faint. The man closer to her smirked. "Of course, ma'am. Let us help you." He gestured for her to keep moving toward the freight car. "It's warmer in there, out of this dreadful wind." His partner scooped up the decoy valise. The switch had been made. They now held the bag they believed to be important, the one she had appeared to drop and retrieve on the train, the one the other passengers had seen her with. Her real treasure was still in the heavy carpet bag on her shoulder. She stumbled forward, her steps slow and deliberate. 10 more feet to the freight car, 5 more. She was at the edge of the platform, the open door of the car a dark, waiting mouth. This was the moment of truth. She could feel the presence of the men directly behind her. Close enough to touch, they were ready to push her inside, to lock the door and take what they wanted. In that final, suspended second, as one of them reached for her arm, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore across the platform. It was a blast of incredible force, a focused shriek of the storm's full fury. It hit the depot with a sound like a cannon shot, and in an instant, every lantern on the platform went out. One moment, there was the dim, yellow, sand-choked light. The next, there was an absolute and terrifying blackness, a darkness so complete it felt as if the world itself had been extinguished. The only thing she could hear was the screaming of the wind. The total, absolute darkness was a physical thing, a smothering blanket that robbed her of all direction. The wind screamed, a solid wall of noise that made thought impossible. For a heartbeat, Evelyn was frozen, adrift in a void of sound and blackness. Then a hand, rough and impersonal, clamped down on her arm. Another seized her other arm. She was trapped between them. She reacted without thinking, her body driven by pure survival instinct. She stomped down hard with the heel of her boot, aiming for the instep of the man on her right. He grunted in pain, his grip slackening for a fraction of a second. It was not enough. The other man shoved her forward, propelling her toward the yawning blackness of the open freight car. She stumbled, catching her balance on the edge of the platform. They were on her again, their breath hot and smelling of stale tobacco against her cheek. They were forcing her in. Then came a sound that was not of the storm, but of deliberate human action, the grating, heavy slide of a door. But it was not the door of her trap. It was the door of a different car, somewhere behind her. A new sound followed, the firm, measured tread of heavy boots on the wooden platform. The men holding her went still, their attention diverted. A light bloomed in the chaos. It was a single, steady glow, held high, cutting a cone of yellow through the swirling, sand-choked air. In the center of that light stood a man. He was tall, and the wind pressed a long, dust-colored coat against his frame. The lantern light caught the hard planes of his face, illuminating a fine, white scar that ran along one high cheekbone. He looked to be in his early 30s, with hair the color of dark honey and eyes that were a clear, startling gray. They were the calmest things in the storm, the eyes of a man who was not surprised or frightened by anything. He held the lantern as if it were an extension of his will, a tool he used to impose order on the night. He took another step forward, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the two men holding Evelyn, the open door of the freight car, and Evelyn herself, her hair wild, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. The two thugs, who had seemed so menacing moments before, now looked like what they were, cheap muscle, suddenly and irrevocably out of their depth. The newcomer stopped a few feet away. He looked past the men, directly at her, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the wind's howl as if it were mere silence. Her late husband's will sent her west alone. He paused, letting the impossible words hang in the air, a statement of fact that made no sense. Then his gaze flickered to the two men, a look of cold dismissal. A gold tycoon met the wrong train and never let her go. The pronouncement was so strange, so specific, that it stunned everyone into silence. It was not a question or a threat. It was a declaration, a story, condensed into a single potent sentence. Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. How could he possibly know? One of Mallory's men found his voice first, a nervous, blustering sound. "This ain't your business, mister. This is a private matter." The tycoon did not even deign to look at him. His eyes remained on Evelyn. But his next words were for them. "You have two choices. You can release the lady, return to the public car, and forget you ever saw her. Or you can stay here and explain your business to the law," as if summoned by the word itself. Another figure emerged from the blowing sand, moving into the edge of the lantern light. It was Deputy Carlos Ortega, his familiar face grim, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. He was not alone. He had a sullen-looking man in manacles at his side, clearly a prisoner being transported. "Having some trouble here, Mr. Hale," Ortega asked, his voice mild, though his eyes were hard as agates. "Just a misunderstanding. Deputy," the man called Hale replied. "These gentlemen were just helping Mrs. Hart find her way out of the storm." Ortega's gaze fell upon Mallory's men, and they flinched as if he had struck them. The deputy knew them, or at least, he knew their kind. "Is that so?" he said softly. "Well, you have found her, and now you can lose her. I suggest you take Mr. Hale's first choice. The night is long, and my prisoner here is getting restless." The two men exchanged a look of pure frustration and defeat. They were caught between a man of immense, unspoken power and a lawman who clearly held him in high regard. Without another word, they released Evelyn's arms, turned, and melted back into the raging storm. Evelyn rubbed her arms, her whole body trembling from the encounter. The Tycoon, Griffin Hale, took a step closer. "Are you harmed, Mrs. Hart?" "I am not," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I do not understand." "I received a telegraph in Cheyenne," he said, his voice low and for her ears only, "from Deputy Ortega. He was forwarding a message from a boy named Eli, a very observant boy. He was concerned you were being followed. My private engine was also diverted by this storm. It seems we have both found ourselves on the wrong train." He then turned to the lawman. "Carlos, it is good to see you." "Griffin," Ortega said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He gave a slight, formal nod, a gesture of respect that was returned in kind. It was a silent handshake, an affirmation of an alliance that needed no words. "I am taking Mrs. Hart to my car," Griffin Hale stated. "She will be my guest until we reach Helena." Ortega nodded again. A wise precaution. He tipped his hat to Evelyn. "Ma'am, it seems your luck is turning." With that, he guided his prisoner back toward the main train. Griffin Hale gestured with the lantern. "This way, Mrs. Hart." He led her to a private car at the very rear of the train, a world away from the grit and grime of the public carriages. The interior was paneled in dark, polished wood, with plush velvet chairs, a thick carpet underfoot, and a small, polished stove that radiated a gentle warmth. It was a cocoon of quiet luxury, a rolling fortress against the storm that still raged outside the windows. He placed the lantern on a small table, and the warm, steady light filled the space. He took her carpet bag from her and set it down, then removed his own long coat, revealing a well-tailored suit beneath. He was not a frontiersman. He was a man of wealth and power, a man who commanded the world around him with an effortless authority. He was the Copper King from the newspaper, and he was even more formidable in person. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He moved to a small cabinet and poured 2 glasses of what looked like whiskey from a crystal decanter. He handed one to her. She took it, but she did not drink. She remained standing, her back straight. "Mr. Hale, I am grateful for your timely intervention, but I must be clear. I am not a woman who can be bought or claimed. I am not your guest to be protected. I am a traveler on my way to conduct my own business." He stopped, the glass halfway to his lips. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cool command in his eyes. It was interest, perhaps even amusement. "Weakness is a liability I have no time for. Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am pleased to see you have none. My statement on the platform was a strategic maneuver, not a declaration of ownership. It was meant to inform Mallory's men that you were no longer a solitary target, but were now under the protection of an entity more powerful and far less forgiving than their employer." "An entity such as yourself," she stated, her tone flat. "Precisely. Consider it a business arrangement, I have a professional aversion to men like Judge Mallory. His methods are inefficient. They disrupt the natural flow of commerce and create instability. Evelyn could not help the small, incredulous smile that touched her lips. And my well-being is simply a matter of commerce to you. Your survival, he corrected her gently, is a matter of principle. And principle, Mrs. Hart, is the bedrock of all good commerce. Mallory is attempting to steal a claim through intimidation. That is an attack on the very idea of ownership, an idea upon which my entire world is built. Therefore, his fight with you is now a fight with me. It was the coldest, most practical explanation for a rescue she could have ever imagined. And yet, it made more sense than any talk of chivalry. This man did not see a damsel in distress. He saw an asset, a principle under threat, and he was moving to protect his interests. The thought was both insulting and, strangely, liberating. He was not helping her because she was a woman. He was helping her because she was in his way, and he had decided to walk the same path. She finally took a seat, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. What do you know of the Bluefinch mine? I know it is a small, undeveloped claim in a valley north of Helena. I also know that geological surveys of that area suggest the presence of a significant quartz vein, the kind that often bears gold. It is a gamble, but one Mallory is clearly willing to kill for, and one I am willing to invest in. I am not looking for an investor, Mr. Hale. I am looking to claim what is mine. To do that, you will need legal counsel, mining engineers, and a crew of men loyal to you, not to the highest bidder. I have all of those things. You have the legal title. It seems we have the basis for a partnership. As he spoke, he pulled a heavy gold pocket watch from his vest. The motion was automatic, the gesture of a man who lived by a strict internal clock. He flipped open the engraved case, and in the lamplight, Evelyn caught the glint of the image etched into the gold. It was a hawk, wings spread, in a steep, powerful dive, a predator, a creature of absolute focus and control. He glanced at the watch face. This storm has made a mockery of the schedule, he murmured, a hint of annoyance in his voice. He snapped the case shut with a sharp, metallic click. But in that brief moment, as he looked at the watch, Evelyn had the distinct impression that it was not the train schedule he was thinking of, but his own, his life, a thing of precise, calculated movements, had been unexpectedly derailed. This woman, this sandstorm, this a wrong train had thrown his perfectly calibrated world off by more than just a few minutes. And as he tucked the watch away, she saw him run a thumb over the case, a small, unconscious gesture that betrayed a crack in his armor of perfect control. His timeline had been altered. Perhaps, she thought. His life had, too. The hawk had been knocked from its dive. The air that greeted them in Montana was thin, cold, and clean. It smelled of pine and distant snow and the metallic tang of raw earth. The train pulled into Helena, a city that clung to the edge of a dry valley like a stubborn prospector. Above it, the jagged peaks of the Assiniboine Range tore at the sky, their stony faces indifferent to the frantic human activity below. Helena was a city built on gold and nerve. Raw timber buildings stood next to ambitious brick facades, and the streets were a river of mud, men, and mules. It was a place of raw potential and equally raw greed. Griffin Hale's presence beside her acted as an invisible shield. Men who might have stared at a woman traveling alone merely tipped their hats and stepped aside. His name was a key that opened every door. He installed her not in a hotel, but in a small, respectable house he owned, complete with a housekeeper who looked at Evelyn with undisguised curiosity but followed her employer's instructions to the letter. The respite was brief. Within 2 days, Evelyn received a formal summons to appear before the Helena Town Council. Griffin had anticipated it. Mallory's influence has preceded him, he said, his face unreadable as he reviewed the summons. He has wired ahead, painting you as an opportunistic adventuress with a fraudulent claim. The council is composed of merchants and mine owners. They value stability above all else. A lone woman with a contested will is the definition of instability. The council chamber was a large room in the new stone courthouse, paneled in dark wood and smelling of cigar smoke and self-importance. A dozen men sat around a long table, their faces a mixture of stern piety and shrewd calculation. At the head of the table, presiding over the meeting, was a man whose face she recognized from a photograph in a Kansas newspaper. Judge Mallory. He was more handsome than the photograph suggested, with silvering hair at his temples and a smile that was both warm and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, met hers for a moment, and she felt the full weight of his predatory intent. He was a snake in a judge's robe. "Mrs. Hart," Mallory began, his voice as smooth as polished river stone. "Welcome to Helena. We are here today to address a matter of some concern to the community. The claim known as the Blue Finch, it has sat dormant for some time, and now you appear, bearing a will of questionable provenance." Evelyn stood before them, her hands clasped to stop them from trembling. She held her head high. "The will is perfectly legal. Judge Mallory, it was executed by a lawyer and filed with the court in my home county." She placed the document, along with a certified copy, on the table. A portly man with a walrus mustache, the town's primary banker, picked it up and squinted at it. "It seems to be in order," he conceded reluctantly. "However, the management of a mine is a significant undertaking. It requires expertise, capital, a large crew, resources that a woman, with all due respect, simply does not possess." Mallory smiled his thin, predatory smile. "Precisely, Mr. Davison. Our concern is for the community. An unworked mine is a dead asset. An improperly worked mine is a danger. We cannot, in good conscience, allow such a vital piece of property to be mismanaged. The council has the authority to place the claim into a trust, to be managed by more experienced hands until a more suitable arrangement can be made." "By experienced hands, I assume you mean your own." "Judge." The voice came from the doorway. Griffin Hale stood there, his arms crossed over his chest. He had not been summoned, but he had come anyway. His presence changed the atmosphere in the room instantly. The council members shifted in their seats. He walked into the room and stood beside Evelyn. He did not look at her, but she felt his solid, reassuring presence. "The laws of this territory are quite clear on the matter of inheritance," Griffin said, his voice calm and level. "The will is legal. The claim belongs to Mrs. Hart. What she chooses to do with it, and who she chooses to partner with, is her business and her business alone. To interfere would be a gross overreach of this council's authority. It would be, in short, an act of theft." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Hale, your own interests in this are well known. You seek to control every major claim in this valley." "I seek to ensure that the rule of law is respected," Griffin countered smoothly. "The honor of a prospector's claim is absolute. We all build our fortunes on that single premise. If you can steal Mrs. Hart's claim today with a flimsy legal pretext, then tomorrow someone can steal yours. Or yours, Mr. Davison. That is the instability you should be concerned with." The argument hung in the air, a threat and a promise. The council was caught between two titans, Mallory, who held their loans and political futures in his hands, and Hale, who represented the very foundation of their wealth. The meeting was adjourned with no resolution, but a clear line had been drawn in the sand. That evening, as a cold wind swept down from the mountains, Evelyn and Griffin sat in the parlor of her small house. "They will try again," she said. Yes, he agreed. Mallory will not give up. We need to move quickly. We need to begin working the mine. A working claim is much harder to seize than a dormant one. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intent. "This brings us to our partnership. I will provide the engineers, the equipment, and the crew. I will handle the legal challenges. In return, I will take a 40% share of the mine's profits." Evelyn considered it. It was a steep price, but without him, she would have nothing. And the other 60% is yours. As his final authority on all major decisions regarding the mine's operation, you are the owner. Mrs. Hart, I am merely your very well-compensated partner." She met his gaze, seeing no deceit, only the straightforward logic of a businessman. "We have an agreement, Mr. Hale." A week later, the town's elite gathered for a fundraising ball, ostensibly to raise money for a new schoolhouse, but in reality, a venue for the powerful to see and be seen. Griffin insisted she attend. "You need to be seen not as a victim, but as a mine owner, as my partner." Evelyn had no fine gowns. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool that Nora Pike had insisted on making for her before she left Cheyenne. It was elegant in its simplicity, but it was not adorned with the lace and jewels favored by the other women in the hall. Beneath the hem, she wore her sturdy riding boots, a silent declaration of who she was. She wore no diamonds. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she entered the grand ballroom of the Helena Hotel on Griffin's arm. The air was thick with the scent of bourbon and perfume. Whispers followed them like the rustle of silk. Mallory was there, holding court in a corner, his cold eyes missing nothing. He watched them, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. The orchestra struck up a waltz. Griffin turned to her. "Mrs. Hart, I believe a public display of our partnership is in order." She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm. He placed his other hand on the small of her back and guided her onto the dance floor. For a man of his size and power, he moved with a surprising grace. The other dancers gave them a wide berth, creating a small island for them in the middle of the swirling room. "You are causing quite a stir," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "I am not the one causing it," she replied, her eyes focused on his shoulder. "I am merely the subject of it. In my experience, the two are often the same thing." He spun her gently, and for a moment she was forced to meet his gaze. There was a spark of something there, something beyond business and strategy. "Mallory believes he can wear you down, that you will eventually sell the claim to him for a pittance just to be free of the trouble. He underestimates me." "Yes," Griffin said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "He does. It is his primary weakness. He underestimates everyone he cannot directly control." They danced in silence for a moment, moving as one to the rhythm of the music. The touch of his hand on her back was a point of warmth and stability in the whirling, judgmental room. It was not a lover's touch, but it was the touch of a protector, an ally, and it stirred something within her that she had not felt in a very long time. As the music ended, he led her from the floor. Their alliance was sealed, announced to all of Helena not with a contract, but with a waltz. The next challenge was not legal, but physical. When they finally rode out to the Bluefinch mine, nestled in a small canyon a few miles from town, they found a discouraging sight. The small open pit that Thomas had started was completely flooded. The early autumn rains had been heavy in the high country, and the pit was now a deep, muddy lake. Griffin's crew of a dozen hard-faced miners stood at the edge, their expressions grim. "It'll take a month of steady pumping to clear that boss, the foreman," a burly man named Silas said, "and more rain is coming." The men grumbled in agreement. A month of lost time was a month Mallory could use against them. Evelyn's heart sank. She looked at the muddy water, a symbol of yet another obstacle, another dead end. Then she remembered the wooden box. That night, she spread Thomas's papers across the table. Among them was not just the main map, but other, older sketches of the canyon. One of them, drawn years ago, showed the topography of the land before the pit had been dug. Thomas had made a note in the margin. Old creek bed runs north of ridge. Ground is soft shale. The next morning, she rode out to the mine alone. She found the spot Thomas had marked. It was a shallow depression, now overgrown with brush, that ran from a point high above the pit and curved down the canyon. An idea, a desperate gamble, took hold. She returned to find Griffin and the crew preparing to set up a steam pump. "Wait," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the crisp air. The men stopped, turning to look at her. She unrolled Thomas's old sketch. "There is an old, dry creek bed here," she said, pointing. "It runs downhill past the mine. If we can dig a ditch from the edge of the pit to this creek bed, we can drain the water using gravity. It would be much faster than pumping." Silas, the foreman, took the map and looked at it, then at the landscape. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's a fool's errand. That's solid rock between here and there. We'd be digging for a year. My husband's notes say it is soft shale." Evelyn insisted. "Your husband," Silas said, his voice dripping with condescension, "dug a hole that turned into a pond. I'll trust my eyes over his notes." A few of the other miners chuckled. Evelyn's face burned with humiliation. She looked to Griffin, expecting him to dismiss her idea as well. But he was looking at her, not at the miners. He studied her face, her earnest, determined expression. He took the map from Silas and looked at it, then walked the ground himself. He came back a few minutes later, his expression thoughtful. He turned to the crew. The laughter died in their throats. "Mrs. Hart is the owner of this mine," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command, "and I am her partner. Her plan seems sound to me. However, I understand your skepticism." He reached into his pocket. "So we will make a wager. You will spend 1 day, a full shift, digging that ditch. I will pay the day's wages for all of you out of my own pocket, whether you hit rock or shale. If, at the end of the day, you have hit solid rock and the plan is a failure, I will pay you a bonus of a second day's wages for your trouble." The miners exchanged glances. Their interest piqued. It was a generous offer. "But," Griffin continued, his gray eyes sweeping over their faces, "if the ground is shale and the plan succeeds, if that water begins to drain, then you will take off your hats. You will come to Mrs. Hart, and you will apologize to a lady." The wager was set. An air of grudging, mercenary effort settled over the crew. Picks and shovels, which had been leaning idle, were now swung with a purpose born not of belief, but of Griffin Hale's coin. At first, the work was slow. The men's movement still laced with skepticism as they tore at the rocky topsoil and tangled roots. Evelyn stood apart, a silent observer, her heart a tight knot of anxiety. She had staked her credibility, and Griffin his money, on a dead man's fated note. For the first hour, the only sounds were the rhythmic thud of picks against hard-packed earth and the grunts of the miners. Then, a new sound, a shovel, driven deep, made a soft, scraping noise instead of the harsh clang of metal on rock. The man holding it, a lanky miner with a suspicious squint, looked down in surprise. He drove the shovel in again. It sank to its hilt in a layer of dark, crumbly shale. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Silas, the foreman, came over and drove his own pick into the spot. The tool bit deep, and he pulled it out with a spray of soft, gray stone. A murmur went through the crew. Thomas had been right. Energized by the prospect of an easier task and a potential victory, the men now worked with a will. The ditch grew with astonishing speed. A brown, ugly scar on the canyon floor, but a beautiful sight to Evelyn. By midday, they had carved a deep, narrow channel that ran from the very lip of the flooded pit to the shallow depression of the old creek bed. They were ready. But the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, had begun to change. A dark line of clouds was gathering over the high peaks of the Assiniboines, a bruised, purple stain that spread with unnatural speed. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that precedes a storm. Griffin scanned the horizon, his expression hardening. "The weather is turning. Let's open it up. Now." The men used their tools to break down the final wall of earth separating the pit from the ditch. At first, It was just a trickle, a small, muddy stream of brown water that snaked its way down the new channel. Then, with a groan, a larger section of the earthen dam gave way. The trickle became a flood. A torrent of pent-up water surged into the ditch, a roaring, churning wave of mud and debris. The plan was working. It was working too well. The miners cheered, a ragged, triumphant sound. But their celebration was cut short by the weather. The heavens opened. Rain began to fall. Not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The dry canyon floor turned to slick mud. The roar of the water draining from the pit was now joined by the drumming of the downpour and the distant rumble of thunder. The creek bed, which had been dry for years, was now a raging river. A wooden barge, a rough platform used for moving equipment, had been moored at the edge of the pit. The sudden, violent outflow of water tore it from its moorings. It surged into the current, turning sideways and slamming into a narrow point in the channel, lodging itself between two large boulders. Debris logs, rocks, brush began to pile up against it instantly. The new, life-saving ditch was now a dam. Water, with nowhere to go, began to back up with terrifying speed, threatening to flood the entire mine works. Worse, Silas and two other men had been working near the blockage, trying to clear some smaller rocks. They were trapped, the rising water swirling around their waists, the current too strong to fight. The rope, Silas yelled, his voice a desperate cry against the storm. "Get us a rope." Chaos erupted. Men scrambled for higher ground. The situation was spiraling out of control. But through the panic, Evelyn moved. She saw a thick coil of hemp rope lying near a supply wagon. She ran, her boots sinking in the mud, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. She grabbed the heavy coil, her mind racing. Griffin was there a second later, his face a mask of grim focus. "Give it to me!" he shouted over the storm. "There is no time," she yelled back. "We have to do it together." She quickly tied one end around the base of a sturdy pine tree, her fingers surprisingly nimble despite the cold. She handed the other end to Griffin. "We have to throw it to them." They braced themselves at the edge of the rising water. Griffin, with his greater strength, swung the rope, letting it fly out over the churning water. It fell short. Again Evelyn cried. They pulled it back, the wet hemp heavy and slick in their hands. They swung it again. This time, Silas managed to grab it. He wrapped it around his chest while the other two men held on to him. "Pull!" Griffin roared. He dug his heels into the mud, his muscles straining. Evelyn grabbed the rope behind him, wrapping it around her hands, adding her own weight and strength to the effort. The rope bit into her palms, raw and burning, but she did not let go. She pulled, her entire body screaming with the strain, the mud sucking at her boots, the rain blinding her. It was a brutal, elemental struggle. It was not about ownership or legal papers. It was about 3 lives against the fury of the water. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, they pulled the men from the current, dragging them through the muddy, waist-deep water until they collapsed, coughing and sputtering, onto safe ground. Just as they pulled the last man clear, a great groaning sound came from the blockage. The immense pressure of the water was too much. The barge splintered, and the dam of debris broke apart with explosive force. The flood water surged down the canyon, and the water level at the mine began to recede as quickly as it had risen. As the rain softened to a drizzle and the exhausted party surveyed the scene, a new sight was revealed. The violent draining of the pit had not just removed the water, it had scoured the bottom of the pit clean, stripping away layers of mud and loose rock. And there, revealed for the first time, was a thick, brilliant white seam running through the bedrock, a massive vein of quartz, and glittering within it, like captured stars, were unmistakable veins of pure, bright gold. It was a mother lode. A stunned silence fell over the entire crew. They stared, mouths agape, at a fortune revealed by a disaster. Then, one by one, the miners turned to look at Evelyn. She stood, soaked and shivering, her hands raw and bleeding, mud streaking her face. Silas, the foreman, walked slowly toward her. He stopped, and the other men gathered behind him. In a single, solemn movement, they took off their hats. "Ma'am," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion, his head bowed. "Mrs. Hart, we were wrong. We ask your pardon." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of a new and profound respect. "And we thank you." The moment of triumph was shattered by a deafening explosion. The ground shook, and the door of the small shed where they stored their dynamite and blasting powder flew off its hinges, a cloud of smoke and splintered wood billowing out. Everyone hit the ground, ears ringing. Before anyone could react, 2 men on horseback galloped into the canyon. They were Mallory's men. "There she is," one of them yelled, pointing a finger at Evelyn. "The murderess." She tried to blow up the whole mine to hide her fraudulent claim. It was a preposterous accusation, but in the shock and confusion, it held a sliver of plausibility. But a third horse followed the first 2. It was Deputy Carlos Ortega, his face set like granite. "Hold it right there," Ortega commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. He dismounted, his revolver in his hand but pointed at the ground. "There will be no accusations until I have assessed the situation." He walked calmly to the shattered shed, his eyes missing nothing. He knelt, examining the ground near the doorway. He picked something up, a short length of burnt fuse. He sniffed it, then picked up something else, a half-burnt match with a distinctive blue tip. Ortega stood and turned slowly. He did not look at Evelyn. His gaze settled on a man standing near the back of the crowd of miners, a man in a clean shirt who did not look like he belonged. He was pale and sweating, despite the cold. "Jonah," Ortega said, his voice quiet. "You are Judge Mallory's accountant, are you not?" The man, Jonah, flinched. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Ortega said, taking a step toward him. "I was on my way out here to check on things after hearing about the storm. I saw you. Jonah, I saw you running from this shed just before it blew. And I know that the general store in Helena only sells one kind of match with a blue tip. Judge Mallory's store." Jonah's face crumpled. He was not a thug. He was a man of numbers, out of his depth in a world of violence and consequence. He was caught. That night, the fire in the parlor crackled, a warm and welcome sound against the lingering chill in Evelyn's bones. The day's events played over and over in her mind: the flood, the rescue, the gold, the explosion. It was too much. She sat in a chair, her hands loosely holding the small wooden box that contained Thomas's journal. She traced the edge of the lid, her thoughts drifting back to her husband, to the life that now seemed a century away. Griffin stood by the window, watching the last of the storm clouds break apart to reveal a sky full of stars. He saw her, saw the way she touched the box, saw the heavy, complicated grief in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of other widows, other survivors. It was the look of a person still shackled to the past. He understood, in that moment, that while he might be her partner, her ally, he was not yet anything more. He knew that to push, to press his own presence into that fragile space, would be a violation. And so, in a gesture of profound respect that she did not see, he took half a step back, giving her the room her heart still needed. As if sensing his quiet retreat, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It was my fault." He turned from the window. "What was your fault?" "Thomas," she said, her gaze fixed on the box. "His death. He took those loans from Mallory, made those foolish risks. Because I wanted more. I was not content with our life, my ambition. It was the bait. And Mallory's debt was the trap. I led him into it. The confession, the guilt she had carried in secret for so long, came out in a ragged breath." Griffin walked over and stood before her. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He offered her the cold, hard truth of the world they now shared. "Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice calm and steady as bedrock. "Evelyn, in this country, people do not die from the love of their own. They die from the greed of others." Griffin's words had settled the dust in her soul, but the dust of Helena was about to be stirred into a storm. The arrest of Jonah, Mallory's accountant, forced a final, public reckoning. It was not a formal trial by a distant territorial court, but a public hearing before the town council, who, in the absence of established judiciary, sat as the de facto arbiters of justice. The entire town crammed into the courthouse, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of wet wool and nervous sweat. This was more than a legal dispute. It was a battle for the soul of Helena. Judge Mallory sat not with the council, but at a table opposite Evelyn and Griffin, his expression one of deeply wounded dignity. He had positioned himself as the victim, a pillar of the community slandered by a hysterical woman and a greedy rival. He began by painting a picture of civic duty, arguing that the explosion, regardless of who said it, proved the Bluefinch mine was a public menace under its current, inexperienced ownership. He spun a web of bylaws and territorial statutes, his voice a soothing, reasonable drone designed to lull the council into seeing him as the only logical custodian of the claim. He was a master of using the law as a weapon. "The facts remain," Mallory concluded, spreading his hands in a gesture of paternal concern. "A woman, alone, with no knowledge of mining, cannot be expected to manage such a dangerous enterprise. For the safety of this community, the claim must be turned over to a responsible party. I am willing to be that party." The council members, men who owed Mallory money or political favors, nodded gravely. Evelyn felt a familiar chill of despair. The truth did not matter when the law could be so skillfully twisted. But then Deputy Carlos Ortega was called to testify. He calmly and methodically presented the evidence from the shed the length of fuse, the blue-tipped match. He produced a sworn statement from the general store owner, confirming that only Judge Mallory's household and businesses bought that specific brand of match in bulk. He then recounted seeing Jonah fleeing the scene. The web Mallory had woven began to unravel. Griffin's lawyer, a sharp man from back east, then produced his own witnesses, a surprise that made Mallory's composure flicker. A telegraph operator took the stand and read a certified copy of a message he had received and delivered to Deputy Ortega. It was from Nora Pike in Cheyenne. Her affidavit was concise and brutal. She described Mallory's men searching Evelyn's room and her subsequent actions to create a diversion at the train depot. She named the two men. Then came the second message, dictated to the telegraph operator by Eli. In simple, clear language, the boy described how he had personally seen one of Mallory's men tamper with the schedule board at the Kestrel depot, switching the placard for the Silver Creek short line with a sign for a defunct cattle spur, deliberately creating a dead end for any traveler following that route. The evidence of a conspiracy, stretching all the way from Kansas, was now undeniable. The final witness was Jonah himself. The accountant was a wreck, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked at Mallory, his eyes pleading, but Mallory's face was a mask of cold fury. Jonah's fear of his employer was great, but his fear of the gallows was greater. "He made me do it," Jonah whispered, his voice cracking. "All of it." "Speak up, son," the banker on the council urged. Jonah took a shuddering breath. "Judge Mallory, he held the original notes on Thomas Hart's debt. He knew about the Bluefinch claim from the beginning. He told me Mr. Hart mentioned it in a letter, desperate to prove he had collateral. The judge didn't want the money. He wanted the mine. He squeezed Hart, drove him into the ground, expecting to claim the mine when he defaulted." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes full of a miserable, belated pity. The will was a surprise. It was the one thing he didn't count on. He sent those men to stop you from ever reaching Montana. When you did, when Mr. Hale stepped in, He told me I had to create a reason for the council to take the mine away. He said an explosion would prove the owner was reckless. A collective gasp went through the room. The full, rotten scope of Mallory's scheme was laid bare. He had not just tried to steal a mine. He had orchestrated a man's ruin and terrorized his widow, all for a piece of land. Mallory rose to his feet, his face a thunderous mask of rage. The veneer of civility was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw violence beneath. Lies, all of it. This is a conspiracy concocted by Hale to ruin me. But no one was listening. His power, built on fear and deception, had evaporated in the face of the plain. Simple truth, and Mallory, a man who never countenanced defeat, made his final, desperate play. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward the main doors of the courthouse. In an instant, the doors burst open. 4 men, hard-faced and carrying revolvers, stepped inside, blocking the only exit. 2 more appeared at the windows on either side of the chamber, their guns also drawn. The crowd screamed. The council members dove for cover under their heavy table. The hearing had become a siege. "This proceeding is over," Mallory snarled, drawing a small, silver-plated pistol from inside his coat. "This town is still mine." But as his men moved to take control, they found their way blocked. A low rumble came from the back of the courtroom as the miners from the Blue Finchen, who had come to support Evelyn, rose to their feet. Silas, the foreman, stood at their head, his big hands clenched into fists. They were unarmed, but they formed a solid, unmoving wall of muscle and loyalty between Mallory's gunmen and the rest of the room. And outside, through the windows, more figures could be seen. Griffin's men from his other mines had heard the news and had come. They did not enter the courthouse, but they formed a silent, formidable ring around it, a clear message that Mallory and his hired guns were surrounded. The lead gunman, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, raised his revolver, aiming it at Silas. "Get out of the way, old man." There was a deafening crack. It was not the gunman's weapon. The scar-faced man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and crumpled to the floor, his revolver clattering on the boards. Deputy Ortega stood near the council table, his own Colt smoking, his aim true and steady. He had not killed the man, but the shot to the shoulder had ended the immediate threat. Mallory, seeing his advantage lost, panicked. He raised his own pistol, his aim wild, pointing it into the terrified crowd. But before he could fire, a second shot rang out, louder than the first. Mallory cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as his silver pistol was torn from his grasp, flying through the air to land skittering across the floor. Griffin Hale stood beside Evelyn, his own revolver in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. He had not aimed at the man. He had aimed at the weapon. He had not sought vengeance. He had enforced the law. The standoff was over. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader disarmed and their odds impossible, dropped their weapons. The spell of fear was broken. The council members emerged from under the table, their faces pale but resolved. The banker, his voice trembling with righteous fury, pointed a finger at Mallory. "This council finds that the Blue Finch mine is the legal and sole property of Mrs. Evelyn Hart, and we find you, Judge Mallory, under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and a dozen other crimes we will spend the next month naming." As Ortega and his men clamped irons on Mallory's wrists, a roar went up from the crowd. The townspeople, so long held in the grip of his quiet tyranny, now let loose their pent-up anger and relief. They shouted, they jeered, they applauded as the fallen judge was led away, his face a ruin of disbelief and hatred. Justice, it turned out, had a voice after all. That night, a profound quiet settled over the Blue Finch mine. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, a soft, silent descent of white flakes that blanketed the raw, wounded earth of the canyon. The world seemed muffled, peaceful. Evelyn stood on the porch of the small office they had built, watching the snow accumulate on the pine branches. The air was cold, but it felt clean, as if the land itself were being washed. She heard the crunch of boots on the snow behind her and knew it was Griffin. He came to stand beside her, not speaking, just sharing the silence. He draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. The warmth of it, and of his presence, was a comfort deeper than words. For a long time, they just stood there, watching the snow fall. The fight was over, the past was settled, and the future was a clean, white, unmarked page. She leaned her head against his shoulder. A simple, natural gesture. It felt right, solid. "If I belong anywhere," she whispered, her breath making a small cloud in the cold air. "Perhaps it is here." He was quiet for a moment. She felt the rumble in his chest as he prepared to speak. She expected something serious, something profound. Instead, his voice, when it came, was a low, warm murmur, laced with a gentle, wry humor that was aimed entirely at himself. "I had always thought you belonged on my schedule," he said softly. "It turns out I belong to you." The winter that followed was a season of consolidation, a time for deep roots to take hold in the newly settled ground. The Bluefinch Mine, under the joint management of Evelyn Hart and Griffin Hale, did not just produce gold, it produced a community. The raw seam of quartz, laid bare by the flood, proved to be even richer than the initial surveys had suggested. Ore wagons rumbled down the canyon road to the smelters in Helena, their heavy loads a steady, tangible heartbeat of prosperity. But it was a different kind of wealth that Evelyn chose to cultivate. She had seen the precariousness of life in the mining camps, the way a widow's fortune could vanish with the last echo of a dynamite blast, the way an orphan could become just another shadow on a dusty street. With her first substantial profits, she did not buy diamonds or fine dresses from back east. She established the Bluefinch Benevolent Fund, a trust dedicated to the widows and children of miners from across the valley. It was a radical idea in a world governed by brutal individualism, and it was met with skepticism by some of the other mine owners. But Griffin supported it without hesitation, matching her initial contribution from his own accounts. The first official employee of the fund was a boy with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that were far too old for his years. Evelyn sent a telegraph to Nora Pike, and 2 weeks later, Eli arrived in Helena on the afternoon train, clutching a worn carpet bag and looking at the mountains with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Evelyn met him at the station. She did not offer him charity. She offered him a job. His title was special courier and clerk for the fund. His first duty was to learn to read and write a proper ledger, and his first salary was a crisp dollar bill, which he folded and unfolded a dozen times, his face a study in solemn wonder. He was no longer an orphan selling papers on a corner. He was a young man with a future. Evelyn found her own future taking a shape she could never have imagined. The woman who had stepped off the train in Cheyenne, a hunted widow bent on a desperate mission she did not understand, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the weight of a payroll, the language of ore samples, and the names of every man who worked for her. She had come west to honor the will of her late husband, a man driven by debts and dreams. She chose to stay because of her own will, a will forged in flood and fire and the quiet, steady strength of the community she was building. The guilt she had carried over Thomas's death had finally receded, replaced not by forgetfulness, but by a quiet understanding. She had been a part of his story, but she was now the author of her own. Griffin, too, was a changed man. The rigid, time-obsessed tycoon who had viewed the world as a series of assets and liabilities had discovered a variable he could not place on a balance sheet. He found himself spending less time in his Helena office and more time at the Bluefinch, not overseeing operations, but simply being there. He learned to listen more than he directed, to value partnership over control. The men who had once feared his cold efficiency now respected his fair-mindedness and his quiet, unwavering support for Evelyn. He still carried his gold pocket watch, but those who knew him well noticed he consulted it less and less. The absolute, unyielding schedule that had governed his life had been replaced by a more fluid, more meaningful rhythm, the rhythm of a shared life. The following summer, on a clear, warm afternoon, they took a train south. It was a journey with no business purpose, no schedule to keep. They rode in a public car, watching the familiar, rugged landscape of Montana soften into the rolling plains of Wyoming. They disembarked not in the bustling hub of Cheyenne, but at a small, quiet depot that sat alone in a sea of sagebrush. Kestrel. The station was no longer the desolate, wind-scoured outpost of their first meeting. A new, brightly painted sign hung over the door, its cheerful letters a beacon in the vast emptiness. It read, "The Wrong Train Cafe." Behind the counter, wiping down a clean surface just as she had been the first day Evelyn met her, was Nora Pike. She had taken her own advice, seen an opportunity, and made a profitable investment in the middle of nowhere. The cafe served travelers from the main line and the newly reopened Silver Creek Short Line, which now ferried silver ore from a new strike in the hills. Nora's coffee was as strong and her tongue as sharp as ever. She looked up as they entered, and a rare, genuine smile broke across her face. "Well, look what the train dragged in. I was wondering when my two most profitable investments would show up to pay a dividend." She poured them 2 cups of coffee without asking. Business is good. People seem to like the name. Gives them a story to tell. They sat and talked for an hour. 3 people from different worlds, now bound together by the strange currents of fate that had converged on this very spot. Eli, Nora told them, was sending her letters, his handwriting improving with everyone. Deputy Ortega had been promoted to sheriff, and Judge Mallory was serving a long sentence in the territorial prison, his name already becoming a cautionary tale whispered in saloons. Later, as the afternoon sun began its long, slow descent, casting golden light across the plains, Evelyn and Griffin stood on the platform where they had first met in darkness and fear. The wind was just a gentle breeze now, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Griffin pulled the gold watch from his vest. He flipped open the lid, the diving hawk glinting in the sun. He looked at it, then at the official station clock on the depot wall. "It's a minute slow," Evelyn observed with a small smile. "Yes," he said, snapping the case shut. "It has been for some time. I find I no longer have the inclination to correct it." He tucked it back into his pocket, his hand lingering there for a moment. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a light she had never seen in them before, a warmth that had melted all the ice. "Wrong by a minute," he said softly. "Right for a lifetime." There, on that dusty platform, by the iron rails that had carried them through so much turmoil and toward each other, they made their promises. There was no preacher, no crowd of witnesses, no fancy words. It was a quiet exchange, as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon. His vow to be her partner, her ally, her home, her vow to be the same for him. It was a partnership not of commerce, but of the soul. As they stood together, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the edge of the world, a flock of hawks circled high overhead, their wings catching the last of the light. The next train, heading north, rumbled in the distance, its whistle a long, lonely, hopeful cry. A gust of wind stirred the red dust at their feet, lifting it in a gentle, shimmering curtain. A final, fitting close to a chapter, and the quiet, unassuming beginning of another. Thank you for listening to our story tonight on Wild West Night. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.